Bernie Sanders recently sat down for an interview with Chris Hayes of MSNBC, and they discussed a plethora of issues, but the issue, of course, that I was most interested in, basically because I know where he stands and I know exactly where he stands and how he came to those conclusions as far as domestic policy is concerned. I was concerned about was his answer for Venezuela, as you can imagine. Now, did he get it right? Did he get it wrong? I don't know. We'll play the clip and let you be the judge.
So let me return to the Venezuela case because it has been so used by conservatives in the U.S. On exactly this. You've been critical of the Maduro regime. I think also critical of some of the steps taken by the Trump administration, sort of ratcheting up pressure. But what is the Bernie Sanders theory of the case for why Venezuela is the way it is? What went wrong there in what was an avowedly socialist project?
Well, I mean, that's a long story that I don't think we have the time to get into. But this is what I will say, and that is that I think there must be free and fair elections in Venezuela. The last elections were not free. Second of all, we have got to do everything that we can to provide humanitarian aid along with other countries so that people do not starve to death. And thirdly, we need to make certain that the United States does not do what it has done time and time again in our history, and that is get involved in overthrowing governments in Latin America. We did that in Chile. We did that in Brazil, Guatemala, other countries. We should not be doing that now. The future of Venezuela must rest with the Venezuelan people, not the Trump administration.
So it seems like he got it right, but he simultaneously got it wrong, which unfortunately seems to be the case recently when it comes to foreign policy issues. One of the reasons I don't get too worried about Bernie Sanders' foreign policy issues is because of usually what he finishes off by saying, which is, we don't need to get into another regime change war. We don't need to get into any proxy wars. We don't need to be establishing coups, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I do have a problem with some of the rhetoric that he perpetuates as far as trying to take an absolutist standpoint as far as whether or not someone is or is not a dictator, condemning the government for not allowing humanitarian aid in without knowing what that aid usually ends up being. And I'm actually pretty sure I figured out exactly why he's been saying some of the things he said, and it seems so back and forth, wishy-washy things. So I want this to come off as if I'm critiquing him or attacking him, I should say, because as a senator, well, especially as somebody who's probably not frequenting the internet as much as people would like to think at 77 years old, I can see as being a member of the old guard could potentially it could potentially be a hindrance when it comes to learning something new that you may not have known, because you're taking the advice of people you pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to tell the truth. But what happens if the people that you're paying aren't doing a good job or not doing what they're supposed to be doing because maybe their own organizations potentially could be giving them skewed information? So first, let's talk about the good things that Bernie Sanders did touch on. He said we don't need to be getting involved. He listed countries like Guatemala. He also listed Brazil, which is surprising because most people aren't really familiar with the overthrowing of some of Brazil's governments. Actually, our CIA was involved apparently in the last major coup, if you will, of the Brazilian government. I don't know if you all remember, it was like worldwide. When they were broadcasting the huge turnouts for massive protests in Brazil. And then it turned out that the person who took over was a white supremacist, like who brought in an all-male cabinet and was basically a Trump-esque, close to or worse than what we see now in Brazil. So I'm glad that he brought that up because that's important to talk about, because we have plenty of examples where this type of behavior is taking place committed by our government intelligence agencies. So I'm really thrilled that he made that firm stance. Now, there's a but when it comes to that. And the but is, Bernie, you then go on, or before you said we should not take over, you made a statement and you said They did not have free and fair elections. I truly am curious as to where you got this idea from. And once again, I think I have the answer to that. But I want you to follow me. And before I go into this, I want you to follow me if you're watching, or if any of his staff is watching. And I want you to think about your guy Matt Duss, who's your foreign policy advisor. Now, Matt Duss, if you don't know, is Bernie Sanders' senatorial foreign policy advisor. And if you ask me, in the nicest way I can put it, he's been doing Bernie Sanders a disservice, and he's seemingly been steering him down the wrong road. That's where a lot of Bernie Sanders rhetoric came from. Some people may not like that reason, but that's what you bring on advisors for. Some people aren't as politically astute, astute when it comes to foreign policy, right? For example, like Tulsi Gabbard is. Bernie Sanders, for example, actually specializes in domestic policy. That's what he's always specialized in. So that's not really a surprise in that regard. Some people are better at some things than other things when it comes to being a politician. There's nothing wrong with that. And I really want people to understand that, because I thought that this was Bernie coming up with his own conclusions. And then I read the tweets of his foreign policy advisor that almost mirror the back and forthishness, right? Yeah, we should, but let's not. Yeah, he is, but let's not. Like, you know what I'm saying? Where it kind of keeps you in this weird, like a proxy war situation, like we've always ended up in, because of this type of rhetoric of, yeah, he's a dictator, but maybe we shouldn't. Oh, just kidding. You know, and they always move on, and they justify the wars like we did with Saddam Hussein, right? You justify killing hundreds of thousands of people just to get the Saddam Hussein, who ultimately never had weapons of mass destruction. So keep this in mind. And I want you all to understand something. So if any of Bernie's staff is watching this, I want you to listen to this. I said about a year and a half ago, and you can verify this information, which I'm sure you will, that we were going to plan a coup in Venezuela. Now, I don't want you to think I just made this up off the top of my head, because I really did not. About a year and a half ago, Bernie Sanders, good God, I am so sorry. Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump are not the same people. But Donald Trump put Venezuela on the Muslim ban list alongside Chad from Africa. A lot of people may not be familiar with that because Chad doesn't get talked about, and there's a reason for that. Now, the reason why they said that was because of terrorist threats, right? Makes perfect sense, except for it didn't, because Chad doesn't really have terrorist threats like that. They're pretty together. Their nation is. In Venezuela, same thing. But what people don't know, because maybe they didn't sync up the two instances, about a day before that, Venezuela got rid of their petrodollar. Yeah, that happened. So we put them on the Muslim ban list. But weirdly enough, it wasn't everybody from Venezuela. It was only their diplomats. So if you had hoped to negotiate with them to make sure that something like this doesn't happen, all of a sudden you've cut off all negotiations. So if someone in Venezuela could have convinced Trump not to go through with this coup and tell him that his administration is once again deceiving him, all that chance went out the window when they established the ban on Venezuelan diplomats specifically. Look this up. So why did I immediately think that we were going to establish a coup? Because in Chad, the old leader was somebody that we had established. It was a right-wing theocratic dictator who ultimately ended up being prosecuted. But that was after he was overthrown. That guy was the one who was constantly beefing with Gaddafi in Libya. So whereas we used to love Chad because they were our ally, because we installed the government, now there's a guy in charge of Chad who was also, coincidentally enough, the elected chairman of the African Union, who made it very clear that he did not want the United States or any of the West involved in African politics and in their economy anymore. And that he was actually working with Germany to make sure that it didn't happen. See, so we put them on the ban list, and we took Sudan off the ban list. I wonder why. For the same reason Chad used to not be on the ban list, but Libya was. So we put Chad on the ban list for the same reason. And it's obviously resources, right? I shouldn't have to explain that, but I'll explain it anyway. Resources. That's what we were after in Libya and Chad. So of course, when they take them off the petrodollar, because the main resource we're always fighting over is what? Oil. There's no coincidence then that Venezuela ends up on that ban list, but only their diplomats who can negotiate a way around a coup and tell Trump that he's being deceived. So the ones who, once again, would have access to him will no longer have access to him, making a coup almost inevitable and unstoppable. So we're seeing it come into fruition right now. You can't say Maduro's a brutal dictator. You can't say that he's crushing his economy. You can't say they're not free and fair elections. And you can't say just basically all the assertions. You can't say, oh, they must take humanitarian aid. All these things you can't say without expecting a coup to take place. Why do you think they have you say these truisms, if you will, and like almost torch you alive rhetorically on the news cycle if you don't agree with them? Because it is those statements that must be repeated over and over again in order to manufacture consent for a coup. Why would I say that? Well, let's take the statement that you made about free and fair elections, Bernie. You said they don't have free and fair elections. So I want to read you this Forbes article from 2013. It says Venezuela's election system holds up as a model for the rest of the world. What? How? Wait a minute. This is total opposite from what I've been hearing from the news. But this is Forbes, by the way. This is Forbes, conservative Forbes. The article is by Eugenio Martinez, who covers elections for Venezuelan newspaper El Universal, and is host of a weekly television show. 2 weeks ago, Venezuelans went to the polls to elect a president to transition their country in the post-Chavez era. Nicolas Maduro, Chavez's hand-chosen successor, and his opponent, Enrique Capriles, they had 34 days of hurling criticisms at each other, pushing back and forth, making promises, and trying to woo over the Venezuelan voters. Now, Maduro, representing the Chavista movement, was expected to win easily, and few anticipated that his margin of victory would end up being an ultra-narrow 1.83%. Judging by his defiant speeches after the election, Maduro seemed to believe he inherited the throne and the legitimacy of a wide margin victory. However, the slim margin propelled Capriles on a quest for lost votes, the crusade to prove the electoral irregularities and cast doubt on the outcome. This campaign has exposed deep political rifts amongst our citizens when it is essential that the people of Venezuela have the greatest confidence in our electoral process. I wish our politicians felt the same way. They do feel that way, but it's because there's no integrity. And if we don't believe there's integrity in the electoral process, then we might do something silly like have an uprising. But anyway, Venezuela employs one of the most technologically advanced, verifiable voting systems in the world, designed to protect voters from fraud and tampering and ensure the accuracy of the vote count. Accuracy and integrity are guaranteed from the minute voters walk into the polls and point to the final tally is revealed. Interesting. Now, some may argue that Forbes article is from 2013, and a lot of things have changed since then. So I went to this other article written on May 20th, 2018. Caracas, Venezuela. The voting system in Venezuela cannot be technically challenged in any serious way. It is open, transparent, leaves a voter-verified paper record, and can easily be recounted if there are any questions about the results. It prevents voter fraud, as a fingerprint is needed to start someone's process. In the early 2000s, I was in the leadership group of a group seeking to fix poor voting systems in Maryland. After the hanging Chad election, in 2000 that put George W. Bush in the White House. Many states rushed to paperless computer voting systems. Maryland spent tens of millions of dollars on die-bold voting systems that were not transparent, provided no voter-verified paper record, and could be hacked to change the outcome. In Maryland, the machines made better anchors than voting systems. A group of Marylanders who formed True Vote Maryland, our goal was a transparent voting system that created a voter-verified paper record that could easily be recounted. It took years of work to get rid of the die-bold machines, as Maryland invested a lot of money, and the Board of Elections liked the ease of corporations handling much of the voting process for them. It was easier for them, and it was impossible to question the result, which is true. You could question it, but like, who would listen to you? They'll say, look at the computer. The recount was phony. If the computer software got it wrong the first time, the same software would get it wrong every time. The computer was always right, even when it was wrong. Now, Venezuela, on the other hand, they put in place a technically excellent voting system that provides quick count of a computer system with the transparency of a voter-verified paper record that can check for computer errors and count the true intent of the voters if necessary. This would work well in the U.S. elections. And I doubt that there would be a need for fingerprint tool, as fake or fraudulent voters are a rarity in the United States, which is true. But hell, you could. They are almost non-existent and can be checked in other ways. Talking about voter fraud. Now, the privacy issue around the government having the fingerprint of every voter would raise more serious issues, which is true. But the moral of my story is that you got paper ballots that are re-verifiable, and they have to use fingerprints to access this. But when Bernie Sanders says, once again, I respect him, but I believe he's getting faulty information from somebody who shouldn't be giving him, or isn't, maybe not even intentionally giving him the wrong information. But he worked for Center for American Progress. Now, whether that's John Podesta's little think tank. Now, whether that is problematic or not, it's problematic enough, right? Because even if he's not being nefarious, he could be absorbing information based off of a think tank that we know has been used to push for neoliberal ideas in the past and in the present, right? He worked for the Center for American Progress from 2008 until he worked for Bernie. Now, once again, I told you where I got my analysis from. And this is from international sources, things that people probably thought were innocuous, that they weren't a big deal. But if you know the history of regime change, you knew what was coming. Now, Bernie, I want to say one more thing. As far as the humanitarian aid is concerned, when you call for humanitarian aid, and once again, Matt Duss should know this. If he considers himself a foreign policy advisor or a foreign policy analyst, then he should know that, especially for regime change wars, humanitarian aid is a precursor and a lie, a preeminent lie, that we have used time and time again to overthrow other governments like Libya. We are the biggest giver. We give Libya the most aid out of all the other countries that give them aid. Guess where that money goes, and guess where those weapons go? To the rebels, or as Tulsi likes to call them, as she should, Al-Qaeda. Okay? So we also did the same thing, obviously, in other countries. Iraq at one point, Libya, we gave those weapons to Chadian rebels who ended up using those weapons to overthrow Gaddafi and constantly give him trouble, but then say that Gaddafi was trying to destroy them. So what happens is they give them weapons, that government starts, the people that we hire start resisting, and then the government has to defend itself and its people, and then they get seen as the bad guys. It's the same strategy we're using in Syria right now, the same strategy we saw in Libya. The same, in Afghanistan or Iraq, same thing. Who do you think taught Al-Qaeda, terrorists, if you will, to make IEDs. All IED stands for is improvised explosive device. We taught them how to use the materials that they had to make explosive devices against us. Well, they were supposed to use them against our enemies at the time, which I believe that war was against Iran. But now they use them against us. We train their leadership. We train them. So, but a lot of that humanitarian aid, almost every time, especially in South America, by the way, it's a front to establish a coup. That's why they're not accepting it. Now, once again, you don't have to don't trust my word for it. Ilhan Omar interviewed Elliott Abrams, and I hope you caught that interview, because she basically said that humanitarian aid is constantly used for a front in every other situation. Why would it be different this time? Who do you think coined that strategy? It was Elliott Abrams. Who did Trump bring in? Elliott Abrams. Now that I think about it, Bernie, maybe you should consider this. When Trump is saying the same thing, Elliott Abrams is saying the same thing. Hillary, Bill, Kamala, everybody in the establishment saying, without presenting facts to you, and we can discuss that another time if you like, they say without presenting fact to you that Maduro is a brutal dictator. But they don't quote these polls or this election integrity, that more election integrity than we have. He's a brutal dictator who got in by 1.25%. And then the reason he's been able to maintain is because he's working on behalf of the 99%. I think you know a little bit of something about that. Your likability is so rare because you work for the 99%. Your approval rating is so high because you work for the 99%. Now, the ones who oppose Maduro, the oligarchs and the corporatists, okay? The bourgeoisie, if you will. Because if you ever come to Miami, which I'm sure you will to campaign, you will see that there are many Venezuelans and many of them are Republican. And almost all of them are exclusively white. And you would almost think that that's representative of what Venezuela looks like, but that's actually not what Venezuela looks like. Venezuela has people who look like me, people who look white, and everything in between. And all those people who tend to look more like myself are also the ones who are disenfranchised by corporations and the oligarchs and the elites, and the ones that Nicolas Maduro spoke to the most. So just like in the United States, because are you surprised by this? Because this is how it works in the United States. Am I not? Am I not right? The marginalized are who you speak to. So who do you speak for and who supports you? The marginalized and those who sympathize and are allies of the marginalized. Those are the ones who speak to you most. It's the same thing. Same thing in the islands. All over the world, if you look, you will always see that the marginalized, for whatever reason, are supporting the government that we overthrow or that we attempt to. That's because the government is probably on their side. And the ones who don't like it, if you look at like Cuba, for example, they run away to America because we give them everlasting life. If you're a Cuban, you got automatic citizenship. Because they were on the sides of the oligarchs that we put in place. So you can't say, look at this is one of the tweets from Matt. The socialists should take a stand on Venezuela. No Trump, no Maduro, no war. That's not a stand. That's muddying the waters. Because if you take away Maduro, you will have a war. You can't say no Trump, but then repeat the same thing that the intelligence agencies told Trump. Because you know that people like Elliott Abrams are the ones leading this facade of call it humanitarian aid, but we know what it's the precursor to. So I hope that somebody watches this video and lets him know, hey, you should check this guy. I don't know him personally. I don't know anything about him outside of the fact that he used to work for Center for American Progress during the Obama administration, and that he is steering Bernie Sanders in the wrong direction. I don't know if it's based off of false information that he is assuming is true, because DC culture tends to assume the truth and assume that these intelligence agencies want the best for the people that they're supposedly going to help and for America. And that's not the case. So, I'd love to know what you think about this, people. Leave a comment, like the video, share it, and more than anything else, always remember, find your balance. Peace. Thanks for watching that segment of Mi Casa es Su Casa. You can donate to our Patreon and keep helping the network grow by clicking on the link in the description below. And also, make sure you join us at JustNForm.com. And finally, make sure you subscribe to us on Roku and be part of the very first independent news network on Roku TV. But more than anything else, always remember, find your balance. Peace.